The story of ancient Egypt does not begin with pyramids. It begins with something far more powerful: a river. The Nile is not just water flowing through desert. It is contradiction made physical. Life carved into death. A ribbon of fertility cutting through one of the most hostile landscapes on Earth. Every year, long before there were kings or gods written in stone, the river rose. Not gently, but with authority. It swallowed its banks, flooded the black earth, and withdrew again, leaving behind a gift. Rich silt, darker than soil, richer than memory. The Egyptians would later call their land Kemet, the Black Land. Everything else beyond it was chaos, the Red Land, desert, silence, death. And between these two worlds, order and disorder, Egypt was born. But before pyramids, there were villages. Before pharaohs, there were chiefs. And before gods took human shape, there was fear. Fear of the river when it failed to rise. Fear of starvation when the floods were weak. Fear that the world itself might not return in the morning. Out of that fear came structure, and out of structure came power. Around 3100 BC, something unprecedented happened. Scattered settlements along the Nile began to unify, not peacefully, not gently, but inevitably. Upper Egypt, the southern stretch of the Nile, and Lower Egypt, the northern delta, became locked in a struggle for control of the river's lifeblood. And out of that conflict emerged the first known ruler of a unified Egypt, Narmer, a figure half history, half legend. On the famous Narmer palette, we see something chilling. A king larger than life, striking down his enemies with ritual precision. Not just warfare, symbolism. This is where Egypt begins to define itself, not as a place, but as an idea. That order must dominate chaos. That the king is not just ruler, but balance itself made human. From this moment forward, Egypt would never see kings as ordinary men. They were something else entirely. They were necessary. What made Egypt different from every other early civilization was not its wealth, not its geography, not even its monuments. It was ideology. The pharaoh was not simply a king. He was divine order on earth, a living bridge between gods and men. This belief changed everything, because when a ruler is divine, obedience becomes sacred. And when obedience becomes sacred, architecture becomes eternal. Temples were not buildings. They were machines designed to maintain cosmic stability. And eventually, that logic would scale upward, into stone, into mathematics, into impossibility, into pyramids. Before the Great Pyramid, there was experimentation. Egypt did not begin with perfection. It stumbled toward it. Mud brick tombs, simple mastabas, early attempts at permanence. Then came a man who changed everything. Imhotep, a priest, architect, and polymath, serving under Pharaoh Djoser. He did something no one had ever done before. He stacked stone upon stone upon stone, creating the first pyramid in history, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. It was not just a tomb, it was a declaration that human beings had begun to think in time beyond death, that kings would not simply be buried, but transformed into eternal structures. Stone became ideology, architecture became theology, and Egypt began its ascent toward immortality. But even here a mystery remains. Why pyramids? Why this shape? Why this obsession with precision, alignment, scale, and permanence? Historians still debate it. Some say it represented the primordial mound of creation in Egyptian myth. Others suggest solar symbolism, the rays of the sun descending to Earth. But beneath all theories lies something simpler, something human: fear of disappearance. The pyramid was not built to impress the living. It was built to resist forgetting. By the time we reach the 4th dynasty, Egypt is no longer experimenting. It is executing perfection. Power is centralized. Resources are organized. Labor is mobilized on a scale the ancient world had never seen. And one man, Pharaoh Khufu, will push this system to its absolute limit. not just to build a tomb, but to build a statement that would survive every civilization after it. A structure so precise, so massive, so mathematically aligned, that even today we still argue about how it was done and whether we truly understand it at all. Because before we can understand the Great Pyramid, we must first understand the world that made it possible. A world where kings were gods, where stone was eternity, and where architecture was the only language that could speak to the afterlife. Around 2600 BC, Egypt was no longer experimenting with stone. It was competing with eternity. And at the center of this ambition stood a ruler we know as Khufu. To later Greek writers, he would be remembered as Cheops, a king of overwhelming ambition, and in some accounts, cruelty. But ancient Egyptian sources tell us something more important. Khufu ruled during the peak of Old Kingdom power, a time when the state could mobilize resources on a scale that would not be seen again for thousands of years. And Khufu's goal was simple in concept, but almost absurd in execution: to build a tomb that could not be rivaled by time itself. The Plateau of Giza was not chosen randomly. It was deliberate, strategic, symbolic. The land sat near the Nile, close enough for transport of stone, but elevated above floodwaters. It also aligned with sacred geography tied to solar worship and royal afterlife beliefs. But perhaps most importantly, it was empty. A blank canvas for something that did not yet exist in human history. And into this silence, Khufu's vision would rise. The Great Pyramid of Khufu contains over 2 million limestone blocks, some weighing more than 2 tons, total mass exceeding 6 million tons, near perfect alignment with cardinal directions, and it was built without iron tools, without wheels as we use them today in heavy construction, without modern engineering calculations. This is where the mystery begins. Because the question is not just what was built, but how. For centuries, the pyramids were imagined as the product of slaves, a brutal system of forced labor. But archaeology tells a more complex story. Evidence from worker villages near Giza reveals something unexpected. Skilled laborers, rotational work crews, organized housing and food supply systems, medical care for injuries. These were not prisoners dragged in chains. They were workers, likely farmers in the Nile's flood season, participating in state projects. And in many cases, they were buried near the pyramids themselves, a sign of status, not punishment. So if it wasn't slave labor, then it was something more advanced, a state machine. Egypt under Khufu functioned like a centralized logistical engine. The Nile became a transport highway. Stone quarries fed into construction routes. Food production was redistributed to sustain massive labor forces. Beer and bread, staples of Egyptian life, became currency of labor. This was not chaos, it was coordination on a civilizational scale. And still, it does not fully explain the pyramid. How do you move multi-ton stone blocks into position without modern machinery? Several theories exist. 1. The straight ramp theory. A massive ramp extended outward as the pyramid grew, but the problem is scale. Such a ramp would need to be longer than the pyramid itself. 2. The spiral ramp theory. A ramp wound around the pyramid as it rose, but this creates logistical issues with angles and precision placement. 3. The internal ramp theory. A hidden corridor system inside the pyramid structure allowed stone to be moved upward. This theory remains one of the most compelling modern hypotheses, but none are universally accepted, because every solution creates new problems, and the pyramid refuses to give up its secret easily. Perhaps the most unsettling feature of Khufu's pyramid is not its size, but its accuracy. The base is leveled with astonishing precision. The sides are aligned almost perfectly to true north. The structure encodes mathematical ratios that later civilizations would only rediscover centuries later. This raises a question that still divides historians. Was this brilliance gradual? Or was it knowledge inherited from something earlier? Inside the pyramid is not emptiness, but complexity. Passageways slope downward into the earth, then rise unexpectedly into chambers. The so-called King's Chamber sits deep within the structure, constructed from massive granite blocks, transported from hundreds of kilometers away. Above it, relieving chambers distribute weight in a way that shows advanced structural understanding. This is not a crude tomb, it is engineered architecture, and yet its purpose remains partially hidden, because Khufu's body was never found. No mummy, no burial goods, only structure. One of the greatest mysteries of the Great Pyramid is not how it was built, but what it was ultimately used for. There is no definitive burial evidence inside, no inscription confirming completion, no clear narrative from Khufu's own time explaining its function in detail. It stands instead as something else, a monument without closure, a structure that ends in silence. To understand the pyramid, we must abandon modern thinking. This was not a construction project in our sense. It was theology made physical. A pharaoh did not simply order a tomb, he extended his identity into stone. Khufu's pyramid was not meant to be visited. It was meant to dominate time itself, to declare, "I existed, and therefore I still exist." And so we return to the same question. How did they do it? Not just physically, but intellectually. What level of organization, belief, and knowledge makes something like this possible? The pyramid does not just challenge engineering, it challenges assumptions about human capability itself. The Great Pyramid now stands complete in our story. But Egypt's story is far from finished, because after Khufu comes empire, comes religion, comes collapse, and eventually comes the final turning of history. If Khufu's pyramid was the beginning of something impossible, then what followed was its refinement, and then its quiet decline. Because civilizations rarely collapse in a single moment. They soften first, then fracture, and only later disappear into history. After Khufu's death, power passed not into chaos, but continuation. His successors inherited not just a throne, but an entire state engine designed for monument building. Two names define this phase of Egypt's pyramid age: Khafre, Menkaure, and with them, Giza itself would be completed, not expanded endlessly, but perfected within limits. Because even the old kingdom had boundaries it could not cross forever. Khafre's pyramid is often mistaken as the largest at Giza. It is not, but it looks that way, because it sits on higher bedrock, and because its upper casing stones once gave it a smooth, shining finish. But Khafre's true legacy is not just the pyramid, it is what stands beside it, the Great Sphinx. The Sphinx is one of the most debated monuments in human history. A lion's body, a human head, carved directly from limestone bedrock. Most scholars attribute it to Khafre's reign, but certainty ends there, because its meaning is not carved into stone. It is carved into interpretation. Some see it as a royal guardian of Giza, a solar symbol watching the rising sun, a representation of divine kingship. Others see something more unsettling, a monument whose purpose we have forgotten. Because unlike pyramids, which clearly declare, "This is a tomb," the Sphinx does not explain itself. It only watches. Pyramid construction required centralized control, massive labor coordination, agricultural surplus, administrative stability. But all systems have limits, and by Menkaure's reign, subtle cracks begin to appear, not in stone, but in society. Local governors grow more powerful. Regional administration becomes less unified. The absolute authority of the pharaoh begins to soften at the edges. Egypt is still powerful, but no longer absolute. After the Fourth Dynasty, something extraordinary happens. Pyramids do not gradually evolve. They abruptly change. They become smaller, less precise, less dominant. And eventually, they stopped defining royal identity entirely. Why? Because pyramids were not just tombs, they were expressions of state power. And when state power weakens, so does monumental ambition. The end of the Old Kingdom is not marked by invasion, not by conquest, but by fragmentation. The central government loses control over regional officials. The Nile's floods become less predictable. Agricultural surplus declines, and with it, the ability to sustain massive labor projects. Egypt does not fall all at once. It dissolves. For centuries, Egypt had believed in continuity, that kingship was eternal, that order would always return, that the world was stable by divine design. But now, reality interrupts belief. Local rulers begin acting independently. Temples gain economic power. The pharaoh becomes less a god and more a political figure. The Pyramid Age ends not with destruction, but with exhaustion. Something else changes during this period, the idea of eternity itself. In earlier pyramid texts, kings alone were guaranteed passage to the afterlife, but later, religious development begins to expand this idea. Ordinary people start gaining access to funerary spells and protections. This democratization of the afterlife is subtle, but revolutionary, because it weakens the exclusive divine status of the pharaoh. And when divinity becomes shared, authority becomes negotiable. The pyramids remain, but the world around them changes. Sand begins to accumulate, settlements shift, new dynasties rise far from Giza's original political center. The monuments remain frozen in time, while Egypt moves forward without them, and slowly the meaning of the pyramids begins to fade. They are no longer active instruments of divine kingship. They become memory. There is something unsettling about the Giza plateau after its construction peak, because nothing ever surpasses it. Egyptian architecture continues for thousands of years, but never again reaches the same scale of centralized ambition. It is as if civilization itself recognizes a limit was reached and chooses not to cross it again. We return again to the same question. What were the pyramids? Tombs? Yes. Symbols? Yes. Expressions of divine kingship? Yes. But also something more. They are evidence of a moment when belief, power, and organization aligned perfectly. And that alignment did not last. The Pyramid Age has now reached its peak and begun its quiet retreat into history. But Egypt is far from finished, because after stone comes politics, after politics comes empire, and after empire comes collapse. By the time Cleopatra was born, ancient Egypt was already ancient to itself. The pyramids were older than the memory of the Greeks. The temples of Luxor and Karnak had already been standing for more than 1,000 years, and yet Egypt still endured, not as it once was, but as something changed, something layered, something foreign. In 332 BC, Alexander the Great entered Egypt. There was no major battle, no prolonged resistance. Egypt, exhausted by centuries of foreign rule and internal decline, opened its gates. And Alexander did something crucial. He did not destroy Egypt, he adopted it. He was declared pharaoh, not as conquest, but as continuation, because Egypt had always absorbed its rulers into its mythology. Even conquerors became part of the system. But Alexander did not stay long. He left behind something far more lasting than his presence. A dynasty that would rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The Ptolemies. The Ptolemaic dynasty was unusual in nearly every way. They ruled Egypt, but spoke Greek. They governed Egyptian people, but lived in a Greek cultural world. They built temples to Egyptian gods, but thought in the language of Aristotle. It was not a blending, it was a layering. Egypt beneath, Greece above, and between them, tension. The Ptolemies understood something important. To rule Egypt, you must appear Egyptian. So they did. They took on pharaonic titles. They commissioned temple reliefs in traditional style. They presented themselves as divine rulers in the ancient mold. But behind the ritual, the reality was political instability, succession crises, family infighting, assassinations, civil wars inside the royal household itself. The illusion of divine kingship was still there, but it was cracking. Cleopatra was not the end of Egypt. She was the final expression of its political transformation. Born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, she inherited a kingdom already under pressure. Rome was rising, and Egypt was no longer a dominant power, but a prize. Cleopatra understood something her predecessors did not fully grasp. Power had shifted westward. To survive, Egypt needed alliances, not isolation. Unlike the image later painted of her, Cleopatra was not simply a romantic figure. She was highly educated, politically strategic, multilingual in an empire where rulers often relied on translators. She understood Egyptian culture deeply enough to present herself as a true pharaoh, possibly the only Ptolemy to fully embrace the language of Egypt itself. But her greatest challenge was not internal. It was Rome. Rome did not conquer Egypt immediately. It circled it first, politically, economically, strategically. Egypt was too valuable to destroy. It was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Control Egypt. Control grain. And control grain. Control empire. Cleopatra's alliances with Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony were not simply romantic narratives. They were survival strategies. But Rome was not a court. It was a machine of expansion, and machines do not negotiate endlessly. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra aligned with Mark Antony. Rome saw this as unacceptable. Octavian, Caesar's heir, launched a political and military campaign that would decide the future of the Mediterranean world. The final conflict came to a head at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. It was not just a naval battle, it was the end of Egypt as an independent power. Antony's fleet was defeated, his alliance collapsed, and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria. In 30 BC, Roman forces entered Egypt. Cleopatra's fate became legend. Accounts differ. Poison, a venomous snake, a private, controlled death rather than public humiliation. But the outcome is the same. With her death, Egypt ceased to be ruled by pharaohs. Rome absorbed it, not as a partner, but as a province. What ended in Cleopatra was not just a dynasty, it was a concept. The idea of divine kingship lasting uninterrupted for thousands of years. After her death, no more pharaohs, no royal divine succession, no independent Egyptian monarchy. A system older than Rome itself finally ended under Rome. Egypt did not vanish, it transformed. Temples remained, but worship changed, language changed, governance changed, and eventually, even memory changed. Hieroglyphs stopped being understood. The language of the gods became silent, not erased, but unreadable. The pyramids remained, the temples remained, the Nile still flooded. But Egypt was no longer Egypt in the way it had been understood for millennia. It had become something else, a historical layer inside a larger empire, a memory preserved in architecture, a civilization turned into monument. Cleopatra closes the political story of ancient Egypt, but not its spiritual one, because even after kings disappear, belief systems remain, temples remain, and the question of why civilizations rise and fall still echoes through time. Egypt did not end the day Cleopatra died. Empires rarely end at the moment of political collapse. They linger, they transform. They fade through layers of change that feel gradual in real time, but absolute in hindsight. And in Egypt, the most powerful transformation was not political, it was spiritual. Even after Rome absorbed Egypt in 30 BC, the old religion did not disappear. Not immediately. Across the Nile Valley, temples still functioned, priests still performed rituals, offerings were still made to Amun, Isis, Osiris, Horus, Ptah. The gods of Egypt were not abstract ideas, they were active presences in daily life. To remove them was not like changing a belief system, it was like dismantling reality itself. And Rome, at first, did not try to dismantle it, it simply controlled it. The early Roman administration in Egypt understood something important. Egypt was not just a province, it was an economic engine, and disrupting its religious structure too quickly could destabilize the entire region. So temples remained operational, priesthoods continued, ritual calendars persisted, but something subtle began to change. Authority shifted, because now ultimate power no longer belonged to the pharaoh, or the priesthood, or the temple systems. It belonged to Rome, and Rome had its own gods. By the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Christianity begins spreading through Egypt. At first it is small, localized, often persecuted, but it carries something revolutionary. A single god, no temple economy, no priestly class tied to monumental architecture. No need for the old ritual infrastructure that had defined Egypt for over 3,000 years. And that is what made it unstoppable. Because it did not compete with the old system, it replaced its foundations. Egyptian temples were not just religious buildings, they were economic centers. They owned land, they employed workers, they controlled agriculture, trade, and ritual legitimacy. As Christianity expanded, this entire system began to weaken. Temples lost funding, priesthoods declined, ritual authority diminished, and without ritual authority, the temples became empty shells of their former power. Not destroyed at first, abandoned. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire itself had changed. Christianity became state-supported, then dominant, then exclusive. And in 391 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued decrees that effectively banned pagan worship. Across Egypt, temples were shut down, rituals were forbidden, sacred spaces were repurposed, and for the first time in over 3 millennia, the gods of Egypt were no longer officially worshipped. When a religion disappears, it does not vanish instantly. It becomes quiet first. Statues are still there, but no incense burns. No prayers are spoken. No festivals are held. The gods remain carved into stone, but no longer called upon. And in Egypt, this silence spread slowly across. Luxor, Karnak, Edfu, Dendera, Philae. Each temple becoming less a living space and more a memory. As Christianity expanded, so too did a linguistic shift. Greek and later Coptic replaced older hieroglyphic literacy. Hieroglyphs were still visible everywhere, on temple walls, on tombs, on monuments that had already stood for thousands of years. But fewer and fewer people could read them, and once a writing system stops being understood, it stops being a living language. It becomes decoration, mystery, then silence. The last stronghold of ancient Egyptian religion was the island temple of Philae. Dedicated to Isis, one of the most enduring deities of the Egyptian pantheon, here, even under Roman rule, worship continued longer than anywhere else. Priests still performed rituals, pilgrims still visited, the old gods still had a voice. But it was a voice growing weaker each generation, and finally, it ended. Around the 6th century AD, the temple was officially closed. By order of the Christian Byzantine Empire, the sacred flame was extinguished, not in fire, but in administration. One of the final known hieroglyphic inscriptions was carved at Philae. It was not a declaration of power, not a royal decree, but a prayer, a hope that the words carved into stone would endure. Long after those who carved them were gone, and, in a sense, they did endure, but no longer as language, only as image. After the closure of the temples, Egypt did not disappear. It remained populated, alive, changing. But its ancient identity, its religious world, was gone. What remained was ruins, sand-covered monuments, forgotten scripts, and stories passed down without context. Egypt had become something new, not a civilization of living gods, but a civilization of remembered gods. For centuries, travelers looked at the ruins of Egypt and saw mystery. They saw symbols no one could read, faces of kings no one could name, temples no one could interpret. And gradually, Egypt became a paradox, the most documented ancient civilization that no longer could be understood. The gods of Egypt did not fall in war. They did not disappear in catastrophe. They faded, slowly, quietly, across centuries of cultural transformation. And when they were finally gone, no one remained who could speak their language. Egypt is often told as a story of greatness, of pyramids, of gods, of golden masks and eternal pharaohs. But that framing hides something more important. Egypt is not just a story of rise, it is a story of endurance, and eventually, of unraveling. And if we step back far enough, it becomes something even larger, a mirror. Because Egypt did not collapse in a single way. It collapsed in many ways at once, and that is what makes it so important. Civilizations do not fall like statues struck by lightning. They weaken like fabric under constant strain. In Egypt's case, there is no single cause, no single invasion, no single disaster. Instead, there is a convergence, a slow stacking of pressures until the system can no longer hold itself together. And those pressures fall into 5 major categories. Egypt's entire civilization was built on one predictable force, the Nile flood cycle. When the floods were stable, agriculture thrived, population expanded, surplus supported state projects, but when the floods weakened or became irregular, everything else began to fail. Not immediately, but structurally. Less water meant lower harvests, reduced taxation, smaller state reserves, weaker central authority, and over centuries even small variations accumulate into crisis. Egypt was an administrative miracle. It could mobilize labor, collect resources, coordinate massive construction. But systems that grow too large eventually face a limit. They require more input than the environment can sustain. By the late Old Kingdom and later periods, tomb building declines, pyramid construction stops, central authority weakens. Local governors gain independence. The state does not collapse because it is attacked. It collapses because it becomes too complex to maintain at full strength. When central authority weakens, power does not disappear. It redistributes. Egypt repeatedly shifts between strong centralized kingdoms, fragmented regional rule, competing dynasties. The key pattern is instability in succession. When leadership is clear, Egypt is powerful. When leadership is contested, Egypt fractures. This cycle repeats across millennia, and each fracture leaves the system slightly weaker than before. Egypt was never isolated. It was always connected to surrounding worlds. Levant, Nubia, Libya, Mesopotamia, Mediterranean trade networks. At different times, Egypt absorbed influence, and at other times, it was absorbed. Hyksos rule, Assyrian conquest, Persian domination, Greek administration, Roman control. Each layer adds complexity, each layer shifts identity, and over time, Egypt becomes less a singular civilization, and more a series of civilizations occupying the same land. Perhaps the most underestimated factor is belief. Egypt's power structure was deeply tied to religion. Pharaoh as divine intermediary, temples as economic institutions, rituals as political stability, and religion changes. The entire system changes with it. Christianity did not destroy Egypt. It replaced its operating logic. No more divine kingship, no more temple economy, no more ritual state machinery. A civilization built on sacred structure was replaced by one built on different sacred structure. And the old system simply stopped being functional. If we zoom out far enough, a pattern emerges. Egypt collapses repeatedly, but never randomly. It follows a rhythm. 1. Centralized strength. 2. Environmental stress. 3. Economic contraction. 4. Political fragmentation. 5. Foreign intervention. 6. Cultural transformation. Then the cycle resets under new rulers. Egypt is never truly erased. It is rewritten. And yet, Egypt still feels different from other ancient civilizations. Because even after collapse, it remains visible. The pyramids still stand. The temples still exist. The Nile still flows. Most civilizations disappear into archaeology. Egypt remains in full view. That visibility creates an illusion that it did not fall, only changed. Egypt's greatest achievement was not its monuments, it was longevity. Few civilizations maintain cultural continuity for over 3,000 years, even through foreign rule, language shifts, religious transformation, political collapse, economic decline. Egypt remained a recognizable idea, a place that others continuously reinterpreted, rather than replaced. When Shelley wrote Ozymandias, he was not just describing a statue, he was describing a universal truth, that power does not last, but memory does, and Egypt is the ultimate example of that tension, a civilization that built for eternity, and survived only as memory. Standing in front of the pyramids today, you are not looking at a mystery, you are looking at a record of belief, of organization, of ambition pushed to its limit, and of time. Slowly undoing everything humans try to make permanent. Civilizations do not end when they are destroyed. They end when they are no longer understood. And Egypt never fully ended. It simply stopped speaking in the language it once used to define the world. Join us as we uncover the past. Hit subscribe.